right. Hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome to tonight's program with Charles Chip Lagerbaum. The program is titled Right There, Jonathan Lowder's Truckhouse, 1776 to 1779, History and Archaeology of a Revolutionary War Trading Post. I'm Brenda Harrington, the Adult Programming Librarian here at the Belfast Free Library. I want to thank you all for coming. Tonight's talk with Chip Lagerbaum is part of our Revolutionary Belfast series of programs created to commemorate America's 250th anniversary and leading up to a display of Maine Historical Society's rare copy of the Declaration of Independence, which will be in this room August 13th to 15th. I encourage you to pick up a copy of this program. There's a bunch of them in the back, and join us for more programs in the series. And I need to remind you that if you want to reserve a time slot to see the Declaration of Independence, you have to do that in order to get into this room to see it. And the QR code on the back of this right here will get you there. And from our website, you can do that as well. Before we get to tonight's talk, I also want to mention that next Tuesday, July 21st, 6:30 p.m. at the Colonial Theater, we're hosting a free film, of the classical musical 1776. And it should be really fun, and I hope a lot of people can come. And also tomorrow at 2 p.m. in this room will be a presentation on researching women in the American Revolution. And there's more information about all this in the back and in our program flyer. So please stay tuned and come to more programs. So now to introduce our speaker tonight, Chip Lagerbaum received his MA in History and Archaeology from the University of Maine at Orono with the excavation and analysis of a Revolutionary War truckhouse. You'll hear more about that. An avid diver, he has organized shipwreck surveys of the 1779 Penobscot expedition and the 17th century English galleon Angel Gabriel off Pemaquid. He is the author of 3 books, including Whaling in Maine and Maine to Cape Horn, The Most Dangerous Journey. Chip currently teaches AP US History at the Belfast Area High School, where he helped form the Belfast Marine Institute with its marine-themed educational initiative, The Floating Classroom, dedicated to getting students out on and under the waters of Penobscot Bay and in Waldo County. Wow, that's a lot. So please join me in welcoming Chip Lagerbaum to the Belfast Free Library.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming out tonight. I really enjoy talking about history and archaeology. I say that I stare down 16 and 17-year-olds for a living, so I'm not worried about you guys. So I think we'll be all right. But I want to talk about a truck house. Now, that's the actual term for it. A trading post does exactly what it implied. The trade is done with the native populations, the Penobscot, and this one is an official one. The term truck house is what they used for that operation, because you would truck the goods up to them, that sort of thing. And that's where we get the term truck, and like my pickup truck and things like that. So, and you run a truck house, you are the truck master, okay? And it is called the truck trade overall. Okay, brought you up to speed on that. So a little bit about me. I did get my bachelor's in history at Kansas State University. I'm a true Flatlander. But I got involved in some archaeology there, although it wasn't all that exciting. We excavated Custer's Privy at Fort Riley. But that's a story for another time. So I came to the University of Maine because they offered historic archaeology that goes back more than 150 years, like it would in Kansas, and European history and colonial and so forth. And so I got my master's degree in the mid-'80s. And so I got to work on a whole bunch of different sites. Here we are, if you're familiar, that is Fort Halifax over in Winslow. They were redoing the parking lot. And we had to go in, and the bulldozers are right behind the guy taking the photo here. And we're it was a rush job for us to kind of test out the area and so forth. And that brings up the good point about archaeology. You don't have the funds to just go pick where you want to dig. It's more because something's going in there and you have to go check the area out for cultural impact before it's built, like an airport or things like that. Okay. Well, let's get to Google Earth, my friend. What we're talking about is the Penobscot River region. Here's the mouth of the Penobscot down at Stockton Springs, Fort Pownall, Cape Jellison right here. That's Sears Island, which was originally called Brigadier Island. You got, this is where the bridge is today. That was known as, well, it's Verona Island now, but it was Hog Island. It goes up to Bangor. Eddington Bend is kind of where we're going to talk about in more detail. But that's because the Native Americans, the Penobscots, are living up in Old Town. So let's zoom in a little bit closer as we're talking about now Bangor at this time, and this time we're talking about the 1760s. Just a few houses there. It's a very small village, and it's known as Kenduskeg Plantation, actually, right along the Kenduskeg stream. But you see Eddington Bend really sticks out there. Now, for the Native Americans coming downstream, this is a natural portage area here, because if you're familiar with the river, you got some rips and rapids right in through here, and it's kind of kinky there if you're in a canoe. So there's a natural portage carrying area there. That means that area is used a lot. And that's why we were there. But first, they had to want to build something. And it's 1987. Wow, going on 40 years ago. That just dawned on me here. Anyway, the town of Veazie, Maine gets the okay to build a wastewater treatment facility. And here you see it right here. Before that went in, because there were state and federal funds involved, that we had to go in and archaeologically test out the area for prehistoric or historic impact, that sort of thing. Okay? That's the area that we're talking about. This had been, that entire bend in the river had long been a very important area of cultural significance for the Native Americans, as well as for the early colonists. Like I said, it was a natural portage. If you're familiar with the area there, this is Mount Hope Cemetery, right along in here. So we're talking hilly, it's up above the river, that sort of thing. According to early accounts by colonials, it was also fairly open. There wasn't a lot of trees, and as a result, the Native Americans would use it for to cultivate corn and maize there. It was open area, which there wasn't that much in Maine because it was all heavily forested. So for those reasons, them growing their corns, beans, and squash there, pretty important area. And we knew that when we got assigned to go test that area out. In fact, records indicate that there was a 17th century French trading post. They're called Negu, as well as a 17th and 18th century Native American settlement called Negath. So we're psyched. We're like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. I'm just off the turnip truck from Kansas. I'm like, this is great New England archaeology. And I'm going to go find us a French trading post, Negu. We tested the whole area out. We never found it. In fact, you always do a T-shirt on a dig at the end of the summer or the season. And our T-shirt said, I missed Negu, because we just didn't find it. But it's still there somewhere. We know. All right. So we did survey out the area, though. It involved a lot of transects, cutting through the woods. This is before the ticks really kind of got bad in Maine, so it wasn't that bad, except black flies were really bad. But we would do long transects, and then we would do test pits every so often. And that's how you cover a large area archaeologically. Okay. We dig down maybe a meter or so. Okay. That's enough. And then the archaeologist would come by and sign off and say, okay, fill it in. Let's move on. We would sift. We have a sifter with wire mesh. You could go as small as screen door mesh, but we'll get to that later. But that kind of catches some things that you might not catch while you're digging. So, I mean, that's how you cover a large area archaeologically. Yeah, the black flies were pretty bad. We ended up using Old Woodsman a lot, if you're familiar with that. We did use the bends for a while, but every time you use that and you pick up a pencil, the yellow on the pencil would come off on your hands. And I'm not sure chemically what that did to me, but all right. We worked in all kinds of weather. It's kind of a rush job. This is known as contract archaeology. We don't have the luxury of taking our time and doing that, but we were able to find quite a bit, actually. We found, some traces of Native Americans, like some of the stone projectile points and things like that, campsites, but no town, no Nagas, and no French trading post. And then, well, actually, we also found a site. Turned out to be a cellar hole that housed a 19th century building that we looked up the records on, and it was owned by a woman named Harriet Foyer. And we found that it was a house of ill repute, actually, known as Aunt Hat's Cat House. It catered to the log drives coming down the river. That's another story that we'll talk about. Okay, so back to our site here. As what usually happens on an archaeological dig, we have like 4 weeks, 5 weeks to go hit it hard, dig. Well, it's usually like the last 2 or 3 days. That's when we find something, enough to go. And that's what we did. About that last week of the dig, we started coming down on a bunch of material culture from the colonial era. Okay. A lot of it looked to be 18th century. We had some gun flints here. We had a lot of redware pieces, very kind of cheap, clunky, big earthenware. And that was more like a milk pan, things like that. Chamber pot, which is always good on a site because that's almost like a population counter. If you found 10 chamber pots, you're like, well, okay, at least 10 people there, that kind of thing. And we found a really cool knife, jackknife, with a bone handle with some incisions on it and everything like that. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. That the game was called Mumbledy Peg, that you would play with it and so forth. So we're thinking colonial homestead, maybe some sort of farm, something like that, especially with the redware ceramics. But then we also started finding beads, lots of them actually, as well as about 4 more jackknives. So suddenly, and more gunflints too. So if you're thinking, all right, well, this is either a pretty interesting household doing this, or these are actual maybe trade items. And so that's kind of archaeologically what leads us, to, present the hypothesis that this was a trading post, not just a simple occupation by a farmer. So you dive into the records, which I find almost as interesting as digging into the soils. I love doing research like this. But we found a reference to a Revolutionary War trading post. The Massachusetts House of Representatives wanted a truck house built for trade with the Penobscot Indians in June of 1776, June 29th, actually. So just about 250 years ago, a little over 250 years ago, they decided they wanted that. Okay. The declaration is signed just 5 days later, which I find really cool, that all this is happening about Maine. And it said in this document, it said that they wanted a Mr. Jonathan Lowder to be the truckmaster of this truck house. He was unanimously chosen. So who's Jonathan Lowder? All right. Well, so I started doing more digging on that then. And we find that he was from Boston. Now, this is Captain John Bonner's map of Boston, about 1722. It's a pretty well-known reference source that you can use for the streets and so forth. I found records that indicate Jonathan Lowder was born in Boston about 1733. And his father was named Jonathan Lowder. And his mother was Anne Oliver Lowder. She was from the Oliver family. I found that the elder Jonathan was a peruke maker, which anybody know what that is? That it was a barber, but also a wig maker. And he would maintain the wigs of the well-to-do. In fact, he had a pretty good connection with the governor, Francis Bernard, at the time. And that's going to help get Jonathan Lowder, young Jonathan, moving up the line as well. He fashioned colonial wigs, which I thought was very interesting. Now, young Jonathan grew up on Atkinson Street, which is right here, right across from the rope work, where if you're familiar on how they made cordage back in the day, they would take long strands and line them together on a huge open field kind of thing. And he lived right at the top of what's eventually going to be known as Griffin's Wharf, which if you're familiar with that, that's where the Boston Tea Party is going to happen just a few years as well. So he's right in the middle of all this. Jonathan, the elder Jonathan, became an express rider, delivering mail all over the area, including as far as Connecticut. And one of his clients, though, of his wig-making service was the governor, Sir Francis Bernard. Here's Bernard in the Oval. Now, when the French and Indian War erupted in the 1750s, late 50s, early 60s, young Jonathan Lowder served as a courier. Just like his father, he was good with horses and stuff like that. He was a courier taking messages from Francis Bernard to Jeffrey Amherst, the commanding general up at Crown Point. In fact, Bernard was very touchy about his correspondence. He only had 2 couriers, and one of them was young Jonathan Lowder, that he trusted with his dispatches. I found that Jonathan Lowder was a Mason, got interested in Freemasonry. You can see he got his original lodge at Crown Point with many military servicemen at the time. He's going to be a Mason pretty much the rest of his life, actually, and he's going to help start the lodge in Castine, as well as the one down in Machias. Okay, so the French and Indian War ends. Jonathan Lowder is out of service. He's in Boston. It's 1761, 2, 3, and the economy stinks. There's an economic depression going on. So he uses his connections from Boston. Here's Cape Cod, Cape Ann. He uses his connections from Boston to get a job at Fort Pownall in Stockton Springs, 1766. He shows up there. And so I'm trying to look into how, the connections. Obviously, Francis Bernard may have helped with that. And I come to find out he also knew the commander of Fort Pownall, a guy by the name of Thomas Goldthwaite, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, Fort Pownall is located right on the finger of Cape Jellison, which sticks out into the Penobscot River, commanding the river very nicely. Here's Castine. This is Brigadier Island. Today is Sears Island. And you got Belfast. We're right there. So that's what we're talking about here. Now, Fort Pownall had been built in the final years of the French and Indian War, but now it's basically an administrative center covering the entire mid-coast region here. And those of you with the eagle eye, you can almost see the star of the fort right there. Okay. So it's opening this area up for settlement, and you need to garrison the fort. So Goldthwaite is recruiting people. So Jonathan Lowder may have been recruited to come in. The fort was in operation from 1759 until 1775. Better view of it, an aerial view. That's where the lighthouse is today in the state park. General Jeffrey Amherst actually had a hand in the design of it. And I'm doing a lot of history on this. There may be a book about Fort Pownall at some point. I'm really interested in what's going on down there. So here's Thomas Goldthwaite. He was the one who likely recruited Jonathan Lowder, showed up about 1766. Goldthwaite had been commander since about 1763. He replaced a guy by the name of General Jedediah Preble. You may have heard of the Preble name, very famous in Maine history. Well, one of his sons is going to be Edward Preble during the Barbary Wars in the early U.S. Navy. So Goldthwaite is the new commander. Like I said, he replaced Jedediah Preble. And so there's a big rivalry there between the two. Preble didn't like getting replaced. Goldthwaite maneuvering, a lot of rival for position and power and so forth. A political game. I'm glad that doesn't go on anymore. Okay. Now, Fort Pownall had a truck house, a trading post for the Penobscot Indians. But if you remember the map, here's Fort Pownall and here's Old Town, way up the river. Now, at first, the Native Americans were okay with that, the Penobscots. Yeah, you're over 40 miles away. Good. But eventually, them having to come down the river and back up all the time, they're like, can something maybe happen that's a little bit closer? You know, you know, we would like you to maybe, meet halfway, something like that. That just shows you how important the Indian trade was. So, got some locations here along the river. Again, this is the Kenduskeag Stream. You got the Joshua Chamberlain Bridge here, Eddington Bend, and so forth. Now, the Jonathan Lowder's Truckhouse is going to be right here. But Truckhouse, the first one was in Fort Pownall, and that didn't go over very well. So they put one at the mouth of the Kenduskeag River, and Goldthwaite's son ran that. Then Goldthwaite got replaced for about a year, and Preble came back. His son, John Preble, opened one at the location a little farther up. And this is right at the mouth of the Penjajawik Stream. This is that turn that goes up to the mall or continues on to Veazie and Old Town right there. Used to be an old country western bar there called Nashville Junction, actually, way back in the day when I was in grad school. Anyway, I don't know why that popped into my head, but there was a big gravel bar that stuck out into the river. Well, when the railroad got built, that's going to end at the Penjajawik Stream that fed that gravel bar, and that gravel bar just eventually washed away. That's going to be part of our story later on because some shipbuilding went on there. All right. Well, Fort Pownall's guns were taken by the British on April 15, 1775, just 3 days before Lexington and Concord. A small fleet came up. They demanded the fort's guns, and Goldthwaite signed them over. And Jonathan Lowder was the gunnery officer there at the time, so he wrote out how many cannon were taken, how many sponges, how many rammers, all that stuff. And so that ended Fort Pownall, okay, and Lowder's job there. So from April 1775 onward, what is Lowder doing? We don't hear about him really until he gets named Truckmaster in June of 76. So we've got a year here going on. What's happening here? Well, I found some evidence that he may have been down east in Machias during the attack on the Margaretta. If you're familiar with that story, the British ship Margaretta was captured by a guy named Jeremiah O'Brien and a couple others. I'm still looking into that. I found a reference that said Jonathan Lowder was there. The problem with Lowder is the names are spelled all kinds of different ways. And L-O-U-D, L-O-W-D, that sort of thing, L-A-U-D. But also, everybody's named Jonathan Lowder. I mean, the sons, the fathers, the uncles. I mean, so if you've ever done genealogy, you know of what I speak. I mean, it's just crazy. All right, so I'm still looking into this Machias connection. All right. We do have some historical records, which always help in archaeology. We do know that a great-great-grandson, William Wilder Taylor Jr., in 1912 signed Jonathan Lowder up for the Sons of the American Revolution. We do know that Jonathan Lowder's granddaughter, when she was in her 90s, gave an interview that talking about her grandfather and Bangor being, just a log cabin and a stockade and stuff like that. So we're going to refer to those things. They're going to help us in some ways, but it's almost like a treasure hunt or puzzle pieces and stuff. Some things make sense, some not so. Okay, so let's go back to our site. Talk about a little archaeology now. So we're zooming in on the present Veazie wastewater treatment facility. Imagine in your minds, it's not there. It's just a bunch of woods. And so we get a little bit closer. Now there's some power lines that go along here, and you can actually see our site. It was important enough historically that they had to change the outfall. So this lagoon was supposed to have been right there. So they moved it to maintain this site. So the site's still there. So here's our site. And then this is our archaeological map that we did. We did 2 seasons, like I said. The first season, it was pretty much the last week or so. And then we hit it really hard the following year to try to find the extent of the evidence. So We do proper archaeological techniques, square meter pits. We do horizontal control. We sift using a sifter. Nobody has knees down on the ground there. It's all properly done. You kind of see we had to clear a lot of brush and so forth. And the pits started deepening. Hey, no gray hair. Anyway, we're looking at like the burn layer, the farming, the site itself. So a lot of material coming out. We used the different mesh screens, and once we started finding glass trade beads, and like I said, we found thousands of them. We went down to a window size screen, the screen door type size of mesh. And we had to use water actually to kind of, get to, but we would find a lot of the clear beads and stuff like that. So very exciting. We're getting a ton of information that second season. Here's the site today. Actually, I traipsed out there in April. And I'm walking around, and of course, like I said, 40 years, almost glaciers could have passed through this area here or something like that. But this was the area that we excavated. So let's get back to the excavation. One of the cool things we found was that the structure had a cellar. And that makes sense because you're going to put trade items down there, and maybe that's your refrigeration too for your perishable items, that sort of thing. So you can kind of see the extent of the cellar digging down. You can tell that there was a roof layer. There was a fieldstone chimney that eventually fell down upon the roofing layer. So we start to arrive using stratigraphic profiling, strata, the layers. Anything lower is older. So we can almost arrive at a history of how the structure ended up being in the ground like that. Here's another view of it. And then we do our drawings of it as well, identifying, all the different pieces to it and so forth so that we can see it in profile. With archaeology, you got to get as much information as possible because you can't go back. Well, technically you can. In fact, that's why we do checkerboard excavations because maybe technology now, 40 years later, excavating those might give us even more information. So you never fully, totally excavate a site unless you have to, unless it's going to be totally destroyed. Then you just get as much as you can. So we cleaned up the area for photos. Kind of see where we're at there. I use that photo actually to help orient myself in April. One of the coolest things we found, though, is we came down upon a piece of wood. I know, wicked exciting, but it turned out to be the sill that the structure had rested on, which was very fortunate because you notice it's not very deep. In fact, that was the only piece we found, but it allowed us to do all kinds of things. First off, we'd get it down in profile. We removed the piece we did. But what does it show us? Well, first off, you see that little black line there? They burned the area to clear it. So that's the burn mark. Then the sill went right on it, and then the cellar starts right, at the edge of the building, and then they planked it over and so forth. Okay? So I looked into that. What are you talking about? The sill would have been directly on the ground, similar to something like this. We're pretty sure it was a simple notched log construction because remember the granddaughter's article said, oh, a log cabin. So it wasn't, squared timbers or anything like that. So that kind of helps us rebuild it that way. So we were able to actually, from one little piece, we were able to get a pretty good idea of the extent of the structure itself. And that was pretty cool. And then we could start to identify, and you see the pits that we excavated, and then the ones that we didn't. And then you can start filling things in. Here's the cellar hole. So we recognize, well, wait a minute, the cellar's it's not just one room, okay? So it's a colonial style, hall and parlor type with a central chimney, maybe a second story, although I doubt it, because most accounts say it was a pretty crude, rough structure. So there may have been a loft area, but I don't think of a second story there. And that's probably where, maybe they slept. I don't know. So looking at it, we do know there was a small room and then a larger room with access to the cellar. Now, we do know, according to his granddaughter, that Jonathan Lowder liked to conduct orderly, organized trading procedures. And I guess you kind of had to, being in a small, confined area. And Native Americans, like maybe, oh, I'm interested in this, I'm grabbing this. And it's kind of like watching, 10 teenagers in a store. You're like, whoa, okay, wait a minute. Kind of keeping ideas on that. So we do know that he kept organization of everything. And we know that one of the rooms had a lot of plaster on the wall. Okay, just one room, not both rooms. And so we're like, what the heck is that? And that's because we found, now this is a shot of just plaster on a colonial structure. We didn't find this, but I wanted to give you an example of what plaster kind of looked like at the time. We did find some chunks of plaster, and we found a lot of small cast iron nails. Cast iron nail. Think about that for a little bit. I mean, can you imagine using a cast iron nail on a cold day and hitting it with a hammer? It's going to shatter on you. But then we started thinking, well, wait a minute. This is a truck house. It's for the Native Americans. Are they going to give us the best brand new nails? No. Hey, I got a barrel of cast nails that nobody wants. Let's put them to the truck trade. That sort of thing. And we did find a lot of hand-forged cast iron nails as well. So what's the deal for the plaster and the lathing? Maybe that's what the nails were for. Maybe the nails were used for shingles, for siding. We're not sure. Although we think because it's a log cabin, they probably didn't need shingles on the side. But we did find all kinds of hand-forged nails. Again, the colonial time period is right. Cut nails didn't really start to appear until about the 1800s, early 1800s. Wire nails even after that. So, I mean, even just talking about the nails, and I did this for every artifact, the famous pie chart. But you can see that obviously most of them were hand forged, and then the rest were cast, those cast iron ones. So must have, been used all, for that structure. But what would the plaster mean? Okay. If one room was plastered, it's probably for maybe warmth, but also, I think, for status, like a status indicator. We do know that Jonathan Lowder was married during this time. He married a woman named Deliverance Cook at the start of the war, right about probably when he was named Truckmaster. And we do know that there was a baby girl named Avis, and the three of them living in the truck house in June of 1779. Okay, so maybe the plaster walls were for the family side of things. Or, as we get into some of the other artifacts, maybe it was where he had his important meetings with like the Indian chiefs or the officials coming up from Massachusetts and so forth. Okay, we do have a central fireplace chimney. So little by little, we're getting a mental image of what this place looked like. And I'm trying to find examples of similar possible items to make it look like it. So here's a fieldstone fireplace of a central chimney. One of the cool things we found was this head, a cast iron head, and that was from the andiron in front of the fireplace. Now, why have such a really nice andiron like that unless you're trying to impress somebody? And so we think status was very important to officers on the frontier, including what's known as the tea ceremony. Making sure you had your tea at the right time and so forth, because you're on the edge of civilization. And it was almost something like the Romans trying to keep the barbarians at the gates sort of thing. You want to retain some semblance of, familiarity with culture. And so we think that was part of this as well, a show of status or his position. All right, so we're back to the evidence here. Now, we are pretty sure that the doorway was on the opposite side of the sill that we found. And why is that? Because we found a lot of artifacts on either side of the doorway, like glass trade beads. Found most of the glass trade beads, like right here. We found most of the gun flints, like right there. And I'm thinking, all right, how do we explain that? What do we do here? So the gun flints, remember, these are the first three that we found. We found a whole bunch more, but they were all crummy. I mean, these are in pretty bad shape. That doesn't look like a great flintlock gun, flint, does it? And then we started thinking, well, wait a minute, the truck trade. They're not going to give us the newest, best looking flints. They're going to give us the old ones, the used ones, the maybe ones that can get reworked or something like that. So here are the like newer ones. That's how they should be looking. These are the ones we found. So we're seeing kind of the quality of the truck trade items, not so great. Okay. Now, again, like I said, is it used merchandise? Probably. I mean, a lot of truck masters were accused of trying to make a profit during the war. And so maybe that kind of came into it. Or maybe Massachusetts was just trying to save money and, hey, give them all these used flints. Here's a great illustration of making gun flints. So maybe they were repurposed for the Lowder's Truckhouse. We're not sure. Maybe to save money. But here's just one of the images of it. We found the majority of them. Gun flints on this side, beads on that side. And why is that? So I'm thinking that how about if you got barrels of gunflint by one door and barrels of beads against the other, and on your way out, grab a handful. Okay. You grab a handful of beads. Well, what's going to happen to some of those beads? They're going to go all over. And so they end up in the archaeological record right by the door. You wouldn't want beads all over the floor over here or that, but right by the door, it might be like the candy bars there on the sides of the aisles as you're leaving the grocery store sort of thing. Okay, let's talk about the glass trade beads because we found lots of them. And they were also bone. We found some really pretty hand-painted ones. This was a big honking one that was good size, but most of them were glass trade beads. And so I got into how do you make glass trade beads, and it's very fascinating where you stretch the glass and you kind of, you cut them and you make them hundreds at a time and so forth. These are some that we found. And here are even more. And what's cool about this is that this one string is from one spot on the site. That's why we put them all on one string together, because they were all found right at the same spot. And that was right by the door. So we got into the classifications of them, the descriptions. You can deep dive into beads. I'm not going to, overrun you with that. But I was able to recognize that the vast majority were white, and the least we found were clear. Now, why is that? Well, clear are tough to find to begin with, so maybe we just didn't, maybe they were there, we didn't find them as much. White, very easy to pick out of the dirt as you're screening them and so forth, but we think these were cheap, they were plentiful, and they were used as part of the truck trade. So we're back to the structure again. It's kind of filling in. We're getting a good idea on what is what. So we're thinking, all right, these places have to be supplied. How do they get supplied? Well, we found a couple sailing accoutrements. Okay, these are big, like as you can see, they're good size. Now, was this just something you pounded into the wall you needed, or was this like a big knot detangler or something? That sort of thing. We do know that this is part of a pulley system. And so I'm thinking, all right, well, how does that apply here? Well, remember, this is a elevated area where the truck house is. So here's the river bank. It's fairly steep getting up to it. So you're going to need block and tackle if you're maybe hauling up a barrel full of trade beads or gun flints or anything like that. So what do? I get my daughter to act as scale, and this dates it a little bit because she's now in grad school. But and we walk the riverbank, and I'm looking up, and I'm like, yeah, this would not be easy to unload, items to a truck house, especially up a slope. It wasn't as steep as this, but would possibly be the idea. And so that tells me that there's a lot of connection and contact with Boston. So you think you're out in the sticks, and you are, but you've got constant ships coming all the time. So information, news, letters from home, as well as provisions and stuff like that keep coming. Okay, so here's the structure. Here's the doorway, we think. Here's the cellar, the chimney, the structure itself. The granddaughter said it was a fortified trading post. It was a stockade. So what does that mean? There must have been some sort of defense for it. So we go back to her article there, and you read through it when, Bangor was a log cabin and a stockade. So we're like, okay, well, what kind of stockade? Because we found no evidence archaeologically that it was, other than this reference. Was it pole, hole by hole where you put the pole down like that? Was it more kind of like a crib work? Was it more like over at Fort Western where little spaces between it just to slow the enemy down? We're not sure. We have no idea other than that historic reference that there was some sort of fortification around it. We do know, though, that there was some defensive weaponry involved with this place. We found a couple round balls that are known as grape shot. Okay. Grape shot are these balls that are usually wrapped in canvas, and they're used as a shotgun effect, anti-personnel. They're usually fired by a swivel mounted on a stump. So we believe that there was maybe one of these on the site for defense. Okay. Now, what does a truck house actually do? It trades items. Okay. We do know that this is the Machias truck house that was in operation at the same time. So a lot of the things that they offered, we can that say, hey, I think the Penobscot one did as well, the Veazie truck house. So that's very helpful as well. So we see kind of the transactions. There might be gun repair. There might be sewing repair. There might be you trade your furs in and we give you powder or we give you credit, that sort of thing. Now, we did find some armaments, some, little like buckshot, but we also found some lead musket balls, which are pretty interesting. Now, we do know that they weren't used. They haven't been fired, but we also know that technically they were kind of used. Because if you look really closely, you see a tooth mark on this one. And so did you ever hear of bite the bullet? Or what they would tend to do is they might carry 2 or 3 in their mouth so that they could reload pretty quickly, almost like a carpenter with nails, that sort of thing. I think that's pretty cool that we got a tooth mark there on some of these. And again, we do know there was a ranger force in the area, an American ranger force, and that they were there to protect the area. So we do know that all this kind of went on. So services like this, where you're making a musket ball or things like that. One cool thing we found was lead-covered rocks. And we're wondering that during a shortage, we're wondering if things got so scarce that they tried like putting lead around pebbles and firing those, which I can't think were very effective. But we found it embedded in some pieces of wood, which I think is pretty interesting. So maybe they fired it a couple barrels and said, yeah, that doesn't work very good. Let's move on. We found a couple gun pieces, part of like the frizzen or things like that. We found a trigger. So we do know like they didn't maybe trade in guns, but they may have offered gun repairs, or that might have been part of the ranger force that's in the area. That's why we're combining the history and the archaeology together to give us a better picture of what goes on. Here's a close-up of that Machias one, and you have like, here's a Native American, and he traded for 1 pound of powder, that sort of thing, and it lists like the skins that he brought in and so forth. We found a lot of trade items as well, or like sewing items, including that button that was at the start of my talk. But we think that was Jonathan Lowder's himself because he was a gunnery officer and there's a cannon on it. But we found like, some other pieces. We found a thimble that you couldn't fit on a little kid's finger. And so we're wondering what the heck. So we think it might have been for like a very small girl. Well, we do know that Jonathan Lowder had a daughter there, and maybe Deliverance, the mother, was, showing her how to sew at that time. But we did find a lot of pins and so forth. So there was some apparel repair as well. And then, of course, the great button, which I love, because we think that's definitely a connection with Jonathan Lowder. We found a lot of ironwares as well, like the legs of kettles and pots and rims and so forth. Native Americans love those, really interested in those. Anybody know what this might be? What is it? That's a good possibility, but we think it's more like a strike-a-light, where you would hold it and then use your flint to strike, get the sparks going, to get a fire going, because obviously the strike matches haven't been invented yet. So we think it might have been something like that. But again, that's, the hypothesis that we put out. We did find a lot of slipware ceramic bowls. And I'm thinking, bowls? What the heck? But then I thought, well, wait a minute. There's an American Ranger force there. What better way to feed them than with like stews and stuff like that? And so you need bowls, not trenchards that you're going to eat off of, that sort of thing. So we found a lot of pieces of those. We found a lot of glassware. Okay. And this really told us that this was a English or a British site as opposed to a French site. Here's a wine bottle, piece of a wine bottle bottom. And then this is the square bottles, almost like gin bottles, that sort of thing. And we do know that this is a British or English site, and that's because of the color of the glass. If you ever find a colonial site and you're walking along and you find a piece of glass in there, if it's green or brownish like this, you can fairly assume correctly that it is an English or British site. If it's more clear and if it's blue, you would assume that it's a French site. Anybody know why? When the glass factories made the glass in France, they fired their glass furnaces with wood. And in England, they fired them with coal. And as a result, English or British glass is greenish or darker in color. Here's a couple examples of later ones here. The square and then the wine bottle. But again, that would be English or British glass. Okay. Overall, the artifact totals, we figured that most involved Jonathan Lowder and his family living there, but a significant amount was about trade. 14%, actually, which is a great number for us to say, well, this wasn't just a farmstead somewhere. We found pewter remains from like candlesticks. We did find some blue glass, actually, just one very nice glass that we were able to glue back some of it together. And we think that might have been like on the mantle, as used very, sparingly. So some French glassware. And again, maybe that's a status thing. We found remains of eating utensils, pewter spoons and forks that would have had bone handles, like the images I found. We found a lot of faunal analysis, bones recovered. And we do know that, there were cow, pig, turtle, a lot of fish bone, a lot of fish vertebrae. And then some that we couldn't really identify, just some large animal, which may have been moose or deer or things like that. Now, the tea ceremony that I mentioned, we found a lot of porcelain teaware. And that must have been very important to Lowder. But we think it may have been part of the Indian trade as well, because we found a lot of those pieces. We also found a lot of very nice creamware, manufactured at this time, hand painted. Again, fancy, your socioeconomic status symbol, perhaps. Salt glazed stoneware, again, teacups and things like that. Heavier stonewares. We didn't find any Bellarmine jugs or anything like that, but a lot of heavier salt glaze, as well as big basic utilitarian stuff like the milk pans and things like that. Those were cheap. Those were easy to obtain. They were probably locally sourced and made as well. And then, of course, the chamber pots. Okay, so let's talk about the site itself now. Here it is in 23, 25. This year, that's what I was looking at the other day. Where did all this stuff go? Well, it went to the University of Maine, and it's stored in these drawers here. And that's where they sit. Should anybody else want to expand and research some of it, all the pieces have been properly preserved. The metal items have been electrolytic reduction, rust removed, and then covered in a coating. We found that, anybody recognize what that might be? That's a good possibility, but it's actually a horseshoe. Well, it's not a horseshoe, it's a shoe, but it was for oxen, because oxen are clothed. And so you wouldn't have a whole horseshoe for an oxen, you would have two halves. That's what. So we do know they used oxen, obviously, for woodworking and so forth. What are some other cool things here? Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a piece of scissors, big fish hook. So a lot of these obviously would be items. Oh yeah, here's this. You can't see it very good, but it turns out to be the arm or your glasses, one of the legs of your glasses. And then the ceramics are all organized like that as well. I bring my classes up there all the time. I teach an archaeological elective, and they haul it out, and they're always like, "Mr. Legbaum, that writing looks like yours on the chalkboard." I said, "That was my writing, actually." Okay, so what ends this? Well, now we have to look an archaeological site. You have a terminus antequem. What year did it begin? And a terminus postquem. What year could it no longer have been in operation? And we do know this is the Penobscot expedition, or the British arrival before the Penobscot expedition. We do know that was in June of 1779, and the British conquered the area. They're not going to allow an American-run trading post operating there. So we're pretty sure that that's a good postquem for the structure. So that goes back down to Fort George and Castine, where they use as a soccer field now. It was a quickly thrown together fort. Massachusetts tried to come and take it, and it bogged down. The Army and the Navy fought each other. And so the Americans didn't take the fort. A British relief force under Admiral Collier came up and chased the American fleet upriver. Worst naval defeat for America up until Pearl Harbor, actually. Here's Admiral Sir George Collier, and the British just followed behind as all the Americans beached their ships and burned them. Many of them, right here at Sandy Point State Park, most of the transports were left. The warships continued on upriver. Most of them beached themselves there. And then the warships ended up finally, I always thought this was the Kenduskeag, but it's not. This is actually the Penjajawak, and this is where the waterworks building is now. You're familiar with that. But we think that's where the rest of the ships went. The Sea Dog Brewery is right here, and that's where you have the cannon from there. So all the way up to the Joshua Chamberlain Bridge. Now, Lowder's Truckhouse is even further upstream, though. So this all ended right about here. Lowder's Truckhouse is up there. He's going to be in operation for a little bit, but then the British are going to quickly say, yeah, that's not going to happen. We think General Lovell from the Penobscot expedition may have even visited the Truckhouse. There's a reference to him, visiting some officials in the area. I'd like to think it was there after the defeat. So what happened to Jonathan Lowder? Well, we do know from history and his Sons of the American Revolution application, he got captured, actually, by a French spy by the name of Lunier in September of 1779. So just a month after the Penobscot expedition. Lunier later on changed his name to Joseph Junin and lived in Bangor after the Revolution. In fact, you might recognize his name. He is the first unsolved murder mystery in Bangor. He was murdered in 1791. And I always wondered, Jonathan Lowder have something to do with that? Because maybe not. And he's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery, Joseph Junin. Okay, so Deliverance, his wife, and Avis are going to stay in the Truckhouse after Jonathan gets captured. And he goes on to Quebec, and I found records that he was there, and then he got shipped to Halifax. So he's cooling his heels as a POW, and Avis and Deliverance are staying in the Truckhouse until the Native Americans come. Now, one of the operations that the Truckhouse would do is they would act as a pawn, meaning you can trade in an item and then, for something else, but you have the right to come back and get that item, like a pawn shop today. Well, many of the Native Americans started showing up saying, I want my stuff. And she felt very unsafe. So she ended up moving down to Castine, which was controlled by the British at this time. And she stayed with Jedediah Preble Jr., who had a falling out with his father and they think was a loyalist and living in Castine. And so they lived in Castine, which is where Jonathan Lowder turns up next. I don't know when he was released as a POW, but we do know he's in Castine at the end of the war. This is the Jonathan Lowder house over in Castine, built in 1786. We do know that he had two sons in addition to Avis, the daughter, at this time. And so the family continues. He lived in Castine for quite a few years. Here you see his house. It's right next to the big customs house, and how close it is right down to the water over in Castine. And then this is looking up the hill at it. This is the Jonathan Lowder house. Yeah, very interesting place. It's a bed and breakfast. You can go sleep in it if you want. It's kind of cool. But in the 1790s, Jonathan Lowder was given a 100-acre grant for his wartime service up near the Kenduskeag plantation. And sure enough, he got lot 29, and his truck house is in lot 31. So he right back where he was. He ended up dying in 1814, right before the second British invasion, the Battle of Hampden and the occupation of Bangor during the War of 1812. This is the Sons of the American Revolution emblem by his stone. His remains, along with a bunch of other family members, were eventually reburied in Veazie at Fairview Cemetery. He was originally buried in some of the early Bangor cemeteries, but as Bangor kept growing, they kept saying, hey, if you want your people, go get them. And there's a really sad story about his son, William, coming home with a box full of bones of his dad, his uncle, his brother, a couple kids, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's why I don't know how many bones are buried there, that sort of thing. But the place is known as Lowder Loop, right there in the Veazie Cemetery. As you're coming into Veazie, look on your left. You blink, you'll miss it, but that's where the family is today. And this is William, the son, William Lowder. And they used that power spray stuff that cleaned up the stones here a year or so back, which was really interesting. So Jonathan Lowder Jr. Went into shipbuilding. He disappeared at sea, so he's buried right beside his father. And then Jonathan Lowder Jr.'s wife, Holly, is buried there as well. And then William Lowder's stone with all his kids. He had 14 kids. And infant mortality rates, very high at this time. So not many lived to be adults. Here's the Lowder house, William Lowder house. The site would have been right here. This is into the 1870s and 80s when William died. Here's a modern view of it. Nothing has worked there or been really built there. Oldest son, Jonathan Lowder, became a captain. The other son, William, became a shipbuilder. And this is the site I have. This is the Lowder barn in about 1922. That was torn down as Mount Hope Cemetery expanded, and this is the road that will take you on up to Orono. Now, our excavation of the truck house included recognizing that this was an open field for many years where the truck house had been. So after its demise, we think it was maybe even burned by the Americans to keep from falling into the hands of the British. But we think it was farmed around it for years because of all these plow scars that we found, which had a scattering effect on all the artifacts. So we think the structure just collapsed in on itself immediately after its destruction. But the chimney, we think, remained standing for a long time. And that's because in and among the chimney pieces, we found a bunch of pieces of a redware bottle. And it was probably for rum, and it was probably stashed there by the farmer. Every time he'd take a pass through, he'd be like, take a hook after. So I can imagine that day he came and saw the chimney had collapsed and broke his bottle. Probably sad. But here's the bottle. We were able to recreate most of it. But obviously the rum, long time gone. Well, thank you. Let me for rambling along. Do you have any questions or anything about archaeology or the truck house? Where were the
Megan, we have to put it on it.
Oh,
where were the beads being imported from?
They were actually from Italy. Venice was a big glass bead maker at this time, and they would ship them by like 1,000. Just barrels full. And they were the Native Americans really liked them as part of the trade. We have all kinds of accounts of other truck houses that beadwork was very important to them. And you can see some of their beadwork on their materials.
At the Museum of Natural History in New York, they have some beautiful Eastern Indian beadwork,
Yeah.
beautiful. We always think of it as being more Western, but
Right.
they were doing it here.
Oh, they
as
sure
well-
were.
as well.
The Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor,
Okay,
great collections of it. As well.
nice,
So does the Hudson Museum up in Orono.
cool. Thank you. Well, that was really cool.
Yeah.
How navigable was the river
Yeah.
at the truck house?
That's a great question. In fact, that's why it was located there, because that was known as the height of navigation for ships of that day. Depending on how deep your hold was and your cargo and things like that. And that was, you had to hit it at high tide to get over those rapids where where the dam and waterworks place is today. To get over that, and then to get over that gravel bar, that is as far as you could get with a navigable ocean going vessel. And so that's pretty much, they probably got right there and they said, okay, Mount Hope is right there. This is right before the bend. This is a great spot. Put it right here. Because Jonathan Lowder had been in that area as a soldier at Fort Pownall, and he had, explored that area. So he probably said, I think I know a great spot for it.
Great. Yeah.
Yes, could you explain that oval thing of like making sparks again?
Yeah, I think it was like you hold it where it's kind of on the outside of your knuckles, and then you strike it with a piece of
Oh,
flint.
it was like this big.
It's big enough that I can put my fingers through it.
Oh, okay.
And so when we pulled it out, because my first thought was, like you said, kind of like a link of something, and the archaeologist said, because we found there were also like little like ginks on it and stuff like that, and I'm wondering if it had been used,
What was it made of?
iron.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Hold on. Thank you for cooperating.
Yeah, did you find any sign of ironworking at the site?
Like a forge or things like
Yeah,
that?
a forge or an anvil or anything?
No, but that would have been a potential offering that they would have been able to, like, a repair of a piece, fashion of a piece. Great question. No, and I think that's likely because it was such a brief occupation. If the truck house had been in operation, maybe it's barely 2.5 years old. So we were lucky to find some things at all, really. I think if it had been there longer, because the one in Machias talks about a forge that they had on site, and we haven't found that truck house yet either. That'd be great to kind of find that and see if the assemblages are, comparable. Good question.
You mentioned that, excuse me, that you mentioned that Lowder was captured by the Frenchmen.
Yeah.
And then taken to Quebec and then Halifax. The British were in Halifax.
Right. They
What
were in
was-
Quebec then too.
Why was a Frenchman
Yeah.
capturing an American
Because
and taking him to Quebec for the
Well,
British?
Because I think he was he was involved with the Native Americans in the region, and had been before the French and Indian War. And I think he was looking for work, and so you had two sides to choose from. And I think the British offered him a pretty good deal, and so he became kind of a spy for them, and he ended up capturing a bunch of other people. And I guess he wasn't very good as a trader of items and goods. A lot of the Native Americans didn't care for him. So there's a whole list of suspects who may have offed him. I'd like to think Jonathan Lowder had a hand in it, yeah, very interesting guy, Joseph Junin. Yeah, it's the Bangor Historical Society has a nice little kind of thing about him that they do. If you ever take the tour of the graves up there, they point out his grave.
Okay, I have a question.
Sure.
When you were asked to excavate the area so they could build the wastewater treatment, did
Yep.
you have any inkling that you would find something there,
No.
or not at
Like
all?
I said, we were looking for that, either a French site.
Yeah,
in fact-
that's right. You were looking for something
Yeah,
else.
the archaeologist, his name was Dr. Alaric Faulkner at the time. He had just finished a big book on Fort Castine and San Castan's habitation and everything like that. He and his wife, Gretchen, who's now she runs the Hudson Museum. And so they were really hoping to find Nagu. And so we're all there, and I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to get into French colonial and stuff like that. And he came upon this, and he goes, well, it's not 17th century, and it's not French. Here, Lagerbaum, do that for your thesis. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds awesome. I'm all over it. So,
That's great. That's great. Any more questions? Anybody?
Yeah.
Yep.
What did the Native Americans bring to trade for the stuff that they got from the
Right.
truck house? And then if it, let's say it was furs or food or whatever,
Right.
tell me what it is. Where did that go? Like,
Right.
Where did that go?
The furs would eventually get transported back down to Boston. But I think as the war went on, it became more of almost just kind of like a welfare center almost, where, we know times are tough for you guys, but we don't want you to go cozy up with the British. In fact, I think these truck houses did a great job of trying to keep them, well, at least neutral, if not outright friendly to the American cause. And I think the Native Americans, who, if you think about it, they don't factor much into the historic record or even the archaeological record, yet it was all about them, really. I think they were a lot more shrewd than we might give them credit for in knowing, okay, we're in a tough spot here, and all they had to do was say, well, the British are offering us this. And I think they did that to their advantage, which I think is a very shrewd move on their part at that time, because by then, by the 1770s, the Native American populations in Eastern Maine are pretty thinned out. They had suffered disastrously in the earlier 100 years of French and English rivalry. Yeah, so those furs would probably go down to Boston. But like I said, eventually, yeah, there might be some maybe like moose meat or something like that. But I think it was mostly the furs that were a valuable trade item that they could come up with.
Anybody else?
Hold on.
I was curious about the flints that you mentioned.
The flints?
And
yeah, they actually they came over a lot of times as ballast on board ships, so they were like big flint nodules, and then they would just like those two guys in the picture, they'd start working on them and fashioning them, and toss them in a bucket, and that sort of thing, and make them as you go. And we found a lot of like flint pieces too, so we do know that they probably picked one up and said, okay, now I'll take it, that sort of thing. And those little pieces, called debitage, we're like, oh, another piece of debitage, that sort of thing. But I learned a lot on the archaeology, just like being organized, trying to keep control. Because once you can do that, and this is in the early days of computers, I remember my professor showed up with a 10 megabyte, hard drive, and we're all like, ooh, we'll never fill that. But, once you could do that, then you could almost say, all right, I'm going to sort out all the glass. And then it would just sort it all out. In the old days, that was by cards, and stuff like that. Oh.
being in archaeology, you probably know this, but there was an obsidian arrowhead found on the beach in Castine, which was only the second one found in the state of Maine.
Yeah.
And since there's no obsidian anywhere near us,
Right.
it shows you how wide
The trade was, yeah.
trade,
Which I
yeah.
think explains the famous Viking penny too. I think, they may have been trading with people as far north as Labrador or something. I mean, yeah, trade, and that's another good area to explore, is just how extensive those were. Because again, I don't think we realize that was a pretty well established, not just trading connections, but also trade routes and everything else.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone.